The snow wasn't just cold, it was a killer. And Evelyn Hart knew she was its next victim. She was crawling through a frozen hell on hands and knees, with a leg that no longer listened to her. Her fine golden hair was a tangled mess of ice and sorrow. Her dress, once the color of a summer sky, was now just a frozen rag. The world had gone silent, except for the hiss of the wind and the dull, fading drumbeat of her own heart. She'd been running for hours, or was it days, running from the ghosts on horseback, running from the voices that had chased her out of town. Widow witch, Apache filth. The words had cut deeper than the frostbite that was turning her fingers blue. Her husband was gone. Pity had lasted a week. Then the whispers started. Then the pointing fingers. Then the loneliness of exile. Now, this blizzard was the end of her story. She fell face first into a drift, and for a beautiful, terrifying second, she felt peace, the kind of peace that comes right before the lights go out for good. But then she heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming right for her. Evelyn forced her eyes open. Through the swirling white, a shape began to form. A figure, taller than any man she'd ever seen. The storm seemed to bend around his shoulders, as if it were afraid of him. He was bare-chested in the freezing cold, his skin the color of burnished copper. A necklace of bone rattled against his chest. An Apache. The stories, the whispers, the terror, it all hit her at once. This was the monster from the fireside tales, the savage from the hills, and he had found her. She tried to scream, but only a pathetic croak came out. She clawed backward, her useless leg dragging a pathetic line in the snow. "Please," she choked out, the word turning to ice on her lips. "Please don't hurt me. I can't walk." The man stopped. His eyes, dark and impossible to read, watched her. He was like a hawk deciding if she was prey or just something pitiful and broken. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. She thought he was going to kill her. She was sure of it. But then he did something that made no sense at all. He slowly, deliberately, set his bow down in the snow. He crouched, his hands open, palms facing her. A sign of peace. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough, but somehow gentle. "No hurt." Evelyn stared, trembling, not from the cold anymore, but from a confusion so deep it shook her to her soul. The wind howled, a lonely sound that seemed to come from the beginning of time. He watched her a moment longer. Then he reached for the thick buffalo hide slung across his back and laid it on the ground. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he lifted her. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, as if she were something precious that had been broken. He wrapped her in the heavy fur, and a wave of warmth hit her, so intense it almost hurt. He smelled of pine smoke and something wild and clean. She tried to fight, a last flicker of pride, but she had nothing left. She could only bury her face in his shoulder and let out a dry, racking sob. He started walking. The motion of his strides rocked her into a half-conscious dream. She saw flashes of the storm, the world disappearing behind them as he carried her deeper and deeper into the white wilderness. Where was he taking her? Was this a trick? A kinder, slower way to die? Time melted. Then she heard the creak of a door. She felt a sudden blast of heat. A fire was snapping and crackling somewhere close. He laid her down gently on a bed of soft hides inside a small, rough-hewn log cabin. Smoke curled up through a hole in the roof. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and wood. As feeling returned to her numb limbs, her body began to shake violently. The pain was excruciating. He moved beside her, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. She jerked back, her eyes wide with fear. "Where am I?" she whispered. He looked at her for a long time, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "Safe," he said, and that one word hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge over a canyon of fear. He turned his back to her to stoke the fire, and in the flickering light, She saw them, the scars, a network of old white lines crisscrossing his shoulder blades, the marks of a whip or maybe a knife, healed long ago but never truly gone. And in that instant, everything she thought she knew was turned upside down. He wasn't the monster from the stories. He was a survivor, just like her. He was a man who knew pain. She tried to sit up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through her leg. He turned in a flash, one hand raised, not to strike, but to calm her. He took a pouch from his belt, mixed some crushed herbs with warm water, and began to gently wrap her swollen ankle in soft strips of hide. His hands were steady, patient, careful. She wanted to tell him to stop, to say she could do it herself. But the simple, quiet kindness of his touch broke something inside her. She turned her face away, letting the silent tears fall. "Cold bad," he said softly. "You sleep." She wanted to argue. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. Who was he? Why had he saved her? But the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing her down into the warm furs. Her eyes followed him as he moved around the tiny cabin. He was deliberate, graceful, every motion filled with a quiet reverence. It was as if he were in a church, not a crude wilderness hut. She woke sometime later. The fire had burned low to embers. The storm outside had become a raging monster, the wind screaming through the pines. The man was sitting by the door, a spear laid across his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He hadn't slept. "Why?" she whispered into the quiet. "Why help me?" He didn't turn his head. His voice was a low rumble. "Snow kills both." It was so simple, she almost didn't understand. If he had left her out there, her death would have been on his hands. The land itself would have judged him. His mercy wasn't just charity. It was a duty, an honor code older than any law she knew. A sob caught in her throat. For so long, no one had shown her any mercy at all. The storm slammed against the walls. Outside, she heard the thin, desperate howl of wolves. He rose, opened the door just a crack, and tossed a piece of meat out into the swirling snow. The howling stopped. He closed the door, sealing them back inside their small circle of warmth. She studied his face in the firelight. It was strong, carved from stone and patience. His eyes reflected the flames. She saw a profound loneliness in him, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She tried to thank him, but the words felt too small, too cheap. He just gave a single, slow nod. Rest. She lay back, watching the firelight flicker through the strands of her golden hair. She thought about her husband, a man of the town, a man of rules and sharp opinions. Would he have saved a stranger? An Apache woman? She knew the answer, and that thought was colder than the storm outside. Hours drifted by. The wind finally softened to a low moan. She floated in a space between waking and sleeping, aware of his steady breathing across the room. When she opened her eyes again, a pale gray light was seeping through the cracks in the window shutter. Dawn was coming. He was still awake, sitting cross-legged, his head bowed as if listening to a secret the world was telling him. "What's your name?" she whispered. The silence stretched. She thought he hadn't heard her, or maybe he wouldn't answer. Then his voice came, quiet as a falling leaf. "Talon." The name fit him perfectly, simple, sharp, silent. She curled onto her side, pulling the fur tighter. Her ankle was a dull, throbbing ache, but the fear, the bone-deep terror she'd lived with for so long had begun to melt away. It was being replaced by something else, something she couldn't yet name. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting hers in the dim glow of the dying fire. No words were spoken, none were needed. In that single, silent look, a truth passed between them. Two exiles, two outcasts, had found each other in the heart of the same storm, and in that tiny, forgotten cabin, the world had shifted. Outside, the wind was finally dying. Inside, Evelyn watched the man named Talon and realized, with a jolt that went straight to her soul, that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid of what came next. The morning light that finally broke through was pale and weak, making the world outside look like it was made of glass and ghosts. The fire was just a pile of gray embers, and the silence in the cabin was so thick it felt like you could touch it. Evelyn's ankle throbbed, a dull reminder of how close she'd come to the end. She saw him then. Talon. He was crouched by the hearth, stirring a small pot. Steam rose from it, smelling of rabbit and wild sage. The pale light caught the scars on his back, and she had to look away, a strange mix of shame and awe twisting in her gut. He saw she was awake and nodded toward the pot. "Eat," he said. His voice was like stones rolling in a slow river. She wanted to refuse. Pride was a sharp, familiar pain. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice raspy. He didn't argue. He just ladled a rich, steaming broth into a wooden bowl and set it beside her. The smell was pure agony. It was the smell of life. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them, lifting the spoon to her lips. The first taste was so good it almost made her cry. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days. She managed half the bowl before the shame came rushing back, and she set it down, her eyes burning. Talon turned his back, pretending not to see her weakness. And that small act of silent grace was a greater kindness than 1,000 words of pity. The snow was still piled high against the window, a white prison wall. The storm wasn't over. It had just taken a breath. Evelyn tried to stand, using the wall for support, but her leg gave way, and she fell back with a sharp cry of pain. Talon was across the room in 2 strides, catching her before she hit the floor. She stiffened in his arms. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could almost hear the steady, slow beat of his heart. "You rest," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I can help," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. He let her go slowly, carefully. "Footbat. Wait." She glanced at the shuttered window. "I can't just sit here." He tilted his head, studying her with a look of quiet curiosity, as if her stubbornness was a strange and fascinating new language. He pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked-looking thing, and began to carve on a piece of bark. He drew a crude picture of a foot, tightly wrapped. Then he pointed to her injured ankle and motioned for her to try rewrapping it herself. It was a lesson, she realized. He was teaching her. She took the strip of hide, her fingers clumsy and weak. She tried to copy the knot he'd used, but it slipped. A sound came from his throat, a short, low grunt that was half laugh, half sigh. He knelt beside her, his large, warm hands guiding her smaller ones. The scent of wood smoke was in his hair. She looked up, and their faces were only inches apart. She saw the tiny flecks of gold in his dark eyes, a faint white scar just beside his mouth. In that moment, the storm, the town, the hunger, the fear, it all just vanished. There was only the quiet space between them. Then he pulled back, gave the knot a final, firm tug, and stood up. "Better," he said. "Yes," she whispered, but her chest ached with something that had nothing to do with her injury. The hours passed in a strange, peaceful rhythm. He fixed a broken latch on the door. She folded the few cloths she could find, stacked firewood, brushed the dried mud from her torn dress. They barely spoke. When she dropped a cup, he picked it up for her. When her fingers accidentally brushed his as they reached for the same piece of wood, he didn't pull away. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was becoming a space they shared. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind clawed at the roof, and the whole cabin groaned like a dying animal. Talon put out the small lamp, leaving only the deep red glow of the fire. Evelyn sat huddled in her furs, watching the flames dance. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, her voice small in the roaring dark. He shook his head. Hunt, move. Snow come. I stay. My husband. He hated the snow, she found herself saying. He said it slowed everything down. Talon's gaze met hers. He was listening, really listening, so she kept talking. He died last summer, a cattle raid. After that, they said I was bad luck. They told me to leave. Her throat tightened. When I asked for help, She couldn't finish. Talon didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just picked up another log and placed it carefully on the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. He answered her pain not with words, but with warmth. After a long silence, she dared another question. Do you have anyone? He stared deep into the fire. Had, he said. Just that one word, but it was as heavy as a gravestone. She watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. She saw the grief in the set of his shoulders. And she finally understood. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a fortress he had built around his pain. Later, as she reached to hand him her empty bowl, their fingers touched. This time, they lingered for a heartbeat too long. He stood up abruptly and went to the door, cracking it open to listen to the storm. And that's when they heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. Distant, sharp, gunfire. Evelyn froze. In an instant, Talon had doused the fire with ash, plunging the cabin into near total darkness. He motioned for her to get down, to stay quiet. Through a tiny crack in the window shutter, she could see them. Faint orange lights flickering between the trees. Hunters? Or something much, much worse. In the faint glow of the dying embers, she could see his eyes. They were sharp, alert, like a wolf's. He moved without a sound, a shadow within the shadows. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel his presence nearby, a solid, calming force in the terrifying dark. After what felt like an eternity, the lights in the distance faded. The gunfire did not return. The wind shifted. Talon finally let out a slow breath. Men, he whispered. Close. They'll find us, she breathed, her voice shaking. He shook his head. Snow high, no track, good snow. The absurdity of it, calling this killer storm good snow, struck her. A small, brittle laugh escaped her lips. It was the first time she had laughed in months. He looked at her, his head tilted in confusion. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. A flicker of shared humanity in the dark. As the danger passed, he carefully coaxed the fire back to life. The soft amber light returned, and with it, a fragile sense of safety. Later, as she drifted off to sleep, she heard him murmuring something in his own language. Low and rhythmic. A prayer, maybe, or a song of mourning. Just before sleep took her completely, she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." She thought he hadn't heard, but then his voice came from the darkness, so soft it was almost just a breath. Evelyn. Her eyes snapped open. He had said her name. He'd said it clearly, carefully, as if he were learning the shape of it on his tongue. She forgot how to breathe. He was looking at her from across the small room, his gaze intense in the firelight. Nothing else was said, but in that moment, she knew. Something had changed forever. The storm still raged outside, but inside the tiny cabin, something new and fragile and terrifyingly real had just begun to grow in the quiet. The storm finally broke, leaving behind a world that looked like it was spun from sugar and glass. The sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky, too weak to offer any real warmth. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Evelyn stepped outside, leaning on a sturdy branch Talon had carved into a makeshift cane. The air was so cold it burned her lungs, but it was the clean burn of freedom. Talon was nearby, splitting firewood. The steady thunk of his axe was the only sound in the vast, white silence. Each swing was powerful, measured, a quiet act of defiance against a world that wanted him gone. She watched him, the easy rhythm of his work, the strength in his shoulders. When he looked up and caught her staring, she quickly looked down, a hot blush rising to her cheeks. He said nothing, just lifted his chin, a silent question aimed down the faint track that led away from the cabin, toward town. "Yes," she murmured, her knuckles white on her cane. "I want to try." The walk was a slow, painful agony. Every step was a battle. Talon stayed right beside her, his arm a steady presence she could lean on when her legs screamed in protest. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was comfortable now, a shared language. Far in the distance, a thin plume of smoke rose into the cold air. Dry Creek, the world she had run from. As they reached the edge of town, the sounds of life returned. The creak of wagon wheels, the slam of a door, the hollow thump of boots on wooden sidewalks. It felt loud, jarring, after the peace of the mountains. Evelyn's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Heads turned. At first, it was just curiosity. Then, disbelief. A woman in a faded bonnet gasped. A man hauling a barrel froze, his mouth hanging open. The sight of her, the town's outcast widow, walking side by side with a tall, bare-chested Apache, was enough to stop the town of Dry Creek dead in its tracks. The whispers started immediately, a low, poisonous hiss that spread from person to person. Evelyn could feel their stares like insects crawling on her skin. Children stopped their games to point. The very air grew thick with judgment. She tried to stand taller, to remember what dignity felt like. Talon's hand brushed her elbow, a small, steadying touch. It wasn't a gesture of possession, just support. But to the eyes of the town, it was a confession. Mrs. Keene was the first to find her voice, a sour, pinched woman wrapped in expensive furs. "Lord have mercy!" she screeched, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "She's back, and look at the filth she's dragged in with her." Evelyn flinched as if struck. Talon's face remained a mask of stone. He just kept walking. The sheriff, a portly man named Alder, lumbered out of his office. "Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice a mix of authority and deep unease. "We all thought you were dead." "I nearly was," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The sheriff's eyes slid to Talon, sizing him up. "And him? He saved my life." The words dropped into the charged silence like a boulder into a frozen pond. The murmuring exploded. Mrs. Keene stepped forward, her face a mask of righteous fury. "You expect us to believe that? Alone in the mountains with him? For 2 weeks? Don't play the fool, girl. We all know what that means." A few of the men chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Evelyn's face burned with shame and rage. "You can think whatever you want," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Talon shifted his weight, a subtle movement, but the message was clear. He was ready. Sheriff Alder saw it and held up a placating hand. "Now hold on. Nobody's looking for trouble here." He turned back to Evelyn, his tone softening. "You can get a room at the boarding house, Evelyn. But your friend, he needs to be outside town lines by sundown." "He's not an outlaw," she protested. "Didn't say he was," the sheriff grumbled. "But folks around here are on edge. It's for the best." She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them all how this man had tended her wounds, how he had shared his last piece of food, how his quiet strength had given her a reason to live. But she could see it in their eyes. Their minds were already made up. As she turned to leave, a young boy, no older than 10, threw a packed snowball. It hit Talon square in the shoulder. The boy's mother just watched, a smug look on her face. Talon didn't even flinch. He just calmly brushed the snow from his shoulder, his eyes downcast. But Evelyn had seen enough. She stepped between him and the crowd, her body shaking with a fury she didn't know she possessed. "Stop it!" Mrs. Keene sneered. Protecting your savage now, are you, Evelyn? Perhaps you belong with his kind after all. The laughter that followed was brittle and cruel. Evelyn felt her throat close up. For a moment, she wanted to let the snow swallow her whole. But then she felt the solid warmth of Talon at her back. He hadn't run. He hadn't fought. He was just there, waiting for her. She lifted her chin. "Maybe I do," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. "I belong with anyone who shows more kindness than this town has ever shown me." The words hit them like a physical blow. The laughter died. The sneers faded. In the stunned silence, only the cold wind dared to move. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You best be on your way, Evelyn." Talon looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a tiny nod. Together, they turned their backs on the town of Dry Creek and walked away, leaving a street full of silent, gaping faces behind them. They walked back to the cabin in silence. The betrayal was a fresh, open wound. When they were finally back inside, Evelyn sank onto the stool by the fire, her body trembling. "They think I'm ruined," she whispered to the flames. Talon placed another log on the fire. "You live," he said, as if that was the only thing that mattered. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. "You don't understand. To them, living like this, it's worse than being dead." He was quiet for a long time. Then he knelt beside her, his presence filling the small space. "They fear what they don't know," he said, the English words sounding strange and careful on his tongue. "Fear makes men blind." "And you?" she asked softly. "What do you fear, Talon?" He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Losing peace." The simplicity of it stunned her. No one she had ever known spoke of peace as if it were something precious, something you could hold and protect. She turned and looked out the small window, where the setting sun was bleeding red across the snow. "You gave me peace," she murmured. His hand rested on the floor beside hers, so close their skin almost touched. After a long moment, she let her own hand relax, closing the tiny gap between them. And that's when a long, lonely howl echoed down from the ridge. A wolf. Talon's head snapped up. His whole body went tense. "They come," he said, his voice a low growl. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart starting to pound again. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkening woods. And then she saw it too. A flicker of light, then another, and another, torches. A whole line of them, moving through the trees. "Men," he murmured, "from town." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "They're coming here. For you." He didn't answer. He just reached for his bow, his movements swift and silent. "No!" she cried, hobbling to her feet. "They think you hurt me. If they find you here, they'll kill you. You have to run." He turned to her, his face grim in the firelight. "Go back," he said. "Tell them I am gone. Say nothing." "I won't leave you," she said, her voice fierce. He looked at her, a long, searching look. "If I run, they will hunt forever. If I stay, maybe they see truth." Tears streamed down her face. "They won't see the truth. They'll only see what they want to see." His expression softened, just for a moment. "Then I die honest." Outside, the wind began to rise again. Snow started to fall, soft and thick. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't just another storm. It was a reckoning. Talon set his bow down. He set his knife down beside it. He was going to face them with nothing. He sat by the door, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the approaching lights. She limped over to him, her hands shaking. "Talon." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, but a deep, unshakable calm. It was as if the storm had already passed through him and found nothing left to break. She dropped to her knees beside him. "They'll come for you," she whispered. He gave a single, slow nod, his eyes never leaving the tree line. Then they come for me. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the cabin, forcing icy snow through every tiny crack. The fire faltered, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like angry spirits. Talon stood by the door, a silhouette against the raging white, watching the bobbing lights of the torches grow closer and closer. Evelyn huddled by the hearth, a thick blanket wrapped around her, but the cold she felt had nothing to do with the weather. "They're going to kill you," she whispered, the words torn from her throat. Talon didn't turn. "Maybe," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "But no run." "You don't have to prove anything to them," she pleaded, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. He finally faced her, his eyes dark and intense. "Not for them," he said, tapping his chest with his fingertips. "For me." She pushed herself to her feet, leaning heavily on her cane. "Then I'm staying with you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a look of both sorrow and pride. "Storm bad," he said. "You hide." "I'm done hiding," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. He held her gaze for a long moment, the howl of the wind filling the silence between them. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. "Then we stand." The figures emerged from the blizzard like demons rising from the snow. A mob of grim-faced men, rifles held ready. Sheriff Alder was at the front, his face etched with worry, and right beside him was Mrs. Keene, her eyes burning with a venomous, self-righteous glee. "Evelyn Hart!" a man shouted, his voice rough. "Step away from the savage!" Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She limped to the doorway, Talon a solid presence at her side. She pushed the heavy door open, and they stood there, framed by the firelight, facing the mob. Sheriff Alder slogged a few steps closer. "Evelyn, nobody wants anyone to get hurt. Just let him go, and we'll see you get back to town safely." "He saved me!" she cried out, her voice nearly stolen by the wind. "He carried me through the storm, while the rest of you left me to die." The crowd shifted, muttering amongst themselves. But Mrs. Keene's shrill voice cut through the noise. "You shame yourself, girl! Look what he's done to you! You're half wild, defending this animal." Evelyn trembled, but she held her ground. "If kindness is savage, then I'm proud to be one." Talon remained silent. His stillness was more powerful than any threat. The snow collecting on his bare shoulders made him look like an ancient, immovable spirit of the mountain. "He can't stay here, Evelyn," the sheriff insisted. "There's been too much blood spilled in these hills already. Don't make this another tragedy." Then Talon spoke. His voice was low, but it cut through the wind like a knife. "I fight no one. You leave, I stay quiet. You stay, Storm will choose." The men exchanged nervous glances. One of them spat on the ground. Another raised his rifle a few inches higher. Evelyn stepped directly in front of Talon. "Stop it, please." "He's bewitched her," Mrs. Keene screeched. Tears froze on Evelyn's eyelashes. "No. He taught me something none of you ever did. Mercy." Just then, a furious gust of wind tore through the clearing, extinguishing half the torches and plunging the scene into a chaotic, flickering darkness. Panic rippled through the men. "Fall back!" someone yelled, but Sheriff Alder held his ground. "Evelyn, this is your last chance. You don't belong with him." She lifted her chin, her defiance a fragile, beautiful thing in the face of so much hate. "Maybe I never belonged with you." The world seemed to hold its breath, and then a gunshot cracked through the air. The sound was sharp, shocking. A chunk of bark exploded from the cabin wall, just inches from Talon's head. Before anyone could even react, he moved, not to attack, not to run. He shoved Evelyn behind him, shielding her body with his own. "Hold your fire!" Alder bellowed, but it was too late. The line had been crossed, but Talon didn't reach for his weapons. He didn't shout a war cry. He did the last thing any of them expected. He slowly, deliberately, knelt in the snow. The torchlight flickered over his bowed head. He placed his knife on the ground in front of him. His hands were open, empty. He was surrendering. Evelyn stared in horror. "What are you doing?" she whispered desperately. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a strange, powerful calm. They see fear, they shoot, they see peace. Maybe they stop. "Don't!" she begged, her throat raw. But he just stayed there, a silent, kneeling figure of defiance in a world gone mad. The storm howled around them, but the silence from the mob was even louder. One by one, the rifles began to lower. The men looked confused, their bloodlust draining away, replaced by a grudging, baffled respect. Even Mrs. Keene was speechless. A fire ignited in Evelyn's chest, a wild, brilliant courage. She stepped out from behind him and stood at his side. She placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. Her voice, when it came, was clear and ringing. "You all talk about God. You talk about good and evil, but you left one of your own to die in a storm." She swept her gaze across their faces. "And this man, this savage, he showed me what God's love actually looks like." No one moved. The wind carried her words away into the darkness. She stood taller, her voice rising. "So, if you want him, you're going to have to take me too." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the weeping of the wind. Then Sheriff Alder let out a long, heavy sigh. He lowered his rifle completely. "Go home," he said to the men, his voice heavy with defeat and shame. "This isn't justice. This is just cold." Mrs. Keene let out a gasp of protest, but the fire had gone out of the mob. Shuffling their feet, avoiding each other's eyes, they began to retreat. Their torches faded back into the blizzard until they were gone, swallowed by the storm. Evelyn collapsed to her knees beside Talon, the fight going out of her all at once. Hot tears thawed tracks down her frozen cheeks. He looked at her, and the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Storm ends soon," he murmured. She could only nod, unable to speak. Her shaking hands reached up to brush the snow from his dark hair. He caught her wrist, his touch so gentle it made her heart ache. For the first time, she saw the true cost of his strength. She saw the bone-deep exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet pain of a man who had been alone for far too long. "You could have died," she whispered. He shook his head, his gaze locked on hers. "Better die honest than live hiding." "Then we'll live honest," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Together." The blizzard finally broke, leaving the world silent and draped in silver moonlight. The fire in the cabin glowed like a warm, beating heart. Talon stood and offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation. Her fingers fit perfectly in his. Inside, he built the fire back up, and the small cabin filled with warmth and the scent of cedar. She sat on the hearth, watching the light play across his strong features, and for the first time since her husband died, her own heart felt steady. The last breaths of the storm moaned in the chimney. When the sound finally faded, a deep and profound quiet settled over the world. "What happens tomorrow?" she whispered. "What will they say?" Talon looked toward the door, where the snow lay deep and unmarked, a clean slate. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a low, sure rumble. "We walk east, no eyes there." A small, real smile touched her lips. "Just the wind." He nodded. "Wind does not judge." The fire popped, sending a single bright spark up into the darkness. She leaned into its warmth, her voice filled with a certainty that came from the very bottom of her soul. "Then let it carry our names." He looked at her then, a long, silent moment, that held more meaning than 1,000 words. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just love. It was the fragile, beautiful, and hard-won beginning of both. Outside, the world was still. A new day, the first dawn after the storm, was about to begin, and for the first time in their lives, they would face it together. If you believe a single act of courage can change the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming.